Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, me too.
Yeah. Looks good.
I think we can get started.
All right, I'll kick it off.
Sorry about the delay.
Don't worry about it. Adrian, welcome to our session. This is Mayor Bob. Mike, I can see you. Sounds like we got all our sound stuff fixed. And I understand that you'll be here through about 10:30, maybe longer. And feel free to go when you need to. Thanks for
Okay,
giving
yeah,
us.
I'm gonna need to cut out by 10:15. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, thanks for giving us that heads up. Lyle and I
Yep.
are here. And we are eager to hear about a subject that we're very passionate about, all of us on council. So
And
with
Mayor-
that,
Mayor Bob, this is Julie Thrower. I'm here as well online.
great. Thanks for joining us, Julie. Good to see your face. We've got 4 of us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Michelle, to run the meeting.
All right. Good morning, Mayor, Council, Michelle Grunewald, Community and Economic Development Director. This morning, we've got a work session on housing. I know the council kind of wanted to revisit this very important topic. So we are here this morning to kind of report back to you sort of what's been happening and also provide some overview. Okay, so this morning, our presentation will be done by myself and Adrienne Quinn, and she is joining us remotely, and you can see her on the screen. She is a housing consultant that we have engaged with, and I'm so thankful to work with her because she has a ton of experience. I included her CV, but I was hoping, Adrienne, if you could just give a little bit of background about your professional career and where you're at and how maybe how we also connected.
Great. Thanks so much, Michelle. So again, I'm very pleased to be here and seeing all of you and working with Michelle on this presentation. I have been a homeowner in McCall for 18 years. In terms of my professional background, I'm a land use attorney by training, and in my land use practice, I represented both municipalities and developers as well, both small and large developers. After practicing law for a while, I was appointed by the mayor of Seattle to be the housing director for the city of Seattle. Subsequent to that, I also was the executive director of a foundation in the Seattle area. I then went on to be the director for King County Department of Community and Human Services, which in King County, as you may know, is the county in which Seattle is located. And within that department, which had 500 people, we had the Office of Housing and Community Development. And so that was all of the housing work for King County. After that, I taught at University of Washington in the School of Public Policy. Michelle, is there anything else that you would like me to add?
Adrienne, weren't you a professor for Annette?
Yes, Annette was one of my students years ago. And so I did reconnect with Annette when she became city manager. And so that's how Michelle and I got to know each other. Although I did meet Michelle years and years ago, 18 years ago. She was the planner for the permitting for my house when we built it.
She had to remind me of that. I think that was like 2006 or something. So great. Yeah. So we're so happy to be able to work with Adrienne. She brings a ton of experience and expertise that we don't necessarily have in-house. And then it's also been really nice as we have kind of limited staff capacity to work on housing to be able to reach out to her to kind of keep the ball rolling on all kinds of things. So today, let me just give you an overview of what we're going to talk about during our work session. So first of all, we're just going to talk about housing as a national crisis, but this is not unique to McCall. And so just to give you that perspective, I'm going to go over some housing trends and what other mountain communities are going through. Then Adrienne's going to kind of give us the housing 101. And so we've focused a lot so far in our community on local solutions, so local funding, local programs, that sort of thing. And she's going to kind of bring it back to sort of talk about what's available at the federal level and how those policies work, the financing, and then kind of delve a little bit into her analysis of what we've been doing. And then lastly, we're going to conclude with reminding ourselves about our housing action plan. So where have we been? Where are we currently? What are the strategies that were identified in that process? And then how are we doing on implementation? And so that was adopted in 2022. So we can kind of go through that. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for questions, discussion. However, we both feel like if the council has questions at any point as we're going through this, feel free to just ask us because we can kind of make this informal.
Could I have my first question?
Okay.
Adrian, I enjoyed reading your CV and thought it was so relevant, and we're fortunate. I'm just interested in our agreement with you, how long you'll be with us.
It's time and materials, and so it's as long as the city wishes to have me engaged. So
Thanks.
thank you.
That's what I was hoping was the case.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we feel really fortunate to be able to work with her. Okay, so let's just talk about housing as a nationwide issue. I put together this slide just to talk about housing affordability in our country in general. So basically the figure on the left is showing housing affordability as it relates to American households. So what that figure shows is basically 65 million households out of our 132 million or so are unable to afford a $250,000 home. So just to put that in perspective. On the left side, the median house price in the US right now is about $425,000. So right now, 73% of Americans cannot afford that. So you can see the disconnect between home values and what people can afford. So I kind of wanted to get a show of hands from the council and our public, who owns their own home today? Okay. Keep your hands up if your home is worth more than $425,000, right? So we are the lucky people within this country who have housing. And so I think that's important to point out because often our decision makers, we're really creating programs, policy, funding for people that are not us, right? Like we're the privileged people who have housing, and we're trying to provide those opportunities for other people within our community. So obviously inflation really impacts the cost of housing. So we've seen an increase in interest rates. Basically when interest rates go up, what ends up happening is we're pricing more people out of what they can afford, right? So that's always something to watch as we move forward. We obviously don't have control over that, but it plays into who's able to access housing. Then in terms of housing trends, these are really kind of things that we've seen occur. So I have mountains over cities. So obviously we've seen a lot of people interested in moving to the places that they go on vacation. And this has really occurred prior to the pandemic. We actually saw people working remotely already in our community, but with COVID, we saw a lot more people working remotely and moving out of cities. I just recently was in Minneapolis, and I think that's pretty typical of a lot of major cities and downtowns. People haven't really gone back to the office. So you have these office districts or central business districts that are essentially empty. There's nobody on the streets. And so yeah, communities like ours feel the pressure as people are moving to these sort of amenity-rich communities. In Idaho, we've also experienced political migration. I mean, that's occurring naturally. People are moving to places where they feel like their values are more aligned. And then obviously a rise in costs. We've seen huge cost increases in construction, in land, in labor, and all of those things. So those all impact housing availability. This slide is really to show you what's happening in some of our mountain states. You can see in 2019, Idaho saw its net migration. So we saw actually a really large increase in people coming to our state, Montana as well. And then the blue line is actually November 2021. So Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Arizona, these are places that are receiving a lot of net migration into the state.
Hold on a minute. Right next to us is Colorado. And that doesn't look an impressive number of what's going on there.
Yeah, they're receiving less net migration than states like Idaho, Montana, and Arizona. So as I mentioned, some of these issues are really specific to mountain communities. As I mentioned, the ability to work anywhere has really changed where people live. So I often think of my own family. My oldest brother, he is a software engineer. He was working remotely prior to COVID. But what I noticed is even when that occurred, he started moving around more and making choices about where he was going to be based on kind of lifestyle. I have my second oldest brother. He worked in Lower Manhattan and lived in the city forever. And what I saw during COVID is he basically he now works in a work remote situation. He moved out of the city. So he no longer lives in Manhattan, which is a place that he called home for a very long time, about 20 years. So it's just interesting, like, I think we all have those stories either within our families or people we know. We kind of just see people moving to different places based on their work scenario. And so we basically saw an increase in visitors, especially in McCall. We experienced that during COVID. We saw a lot of people utilizing their second homes and staying here more. And we had a lot more visitation because people had more flexibility about where they could be. And then the other thing that mountain communities experience, especially we've seen in our community, is that people are showing up with higher incomes and generally cash when they want to buy homes. So they're able to compete locals for houses. So the cost of housing has gone up. Often people aren't necessarily financing in traditional ways, and they're able to snatch up properties, which has really impacted our housing supply as well as our costs. So this is just a slide to provide some context. Our median home price at this point is about $750,000. And you can basically rent per bedroom, it's about $1,000. And so in 2018, we did a housing needs assessment. And at that point, we were had identified that we needed 730 local housing units. We are updating our needs assessment to get current numbers this year. So we'll have an updated number, but we know that number has only grown because of our housing situation.
Okay, stop right there. That's an impressive number, $1,000. And I've drank enough coffee to try to keep up with you. Per bedroom.
Yeah, per bedroom.
So a small little 3-bedroom starter home. We've been hearing from a lot of people that it's around $3,000.
Yeah.
Just like what you were talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously that varies, but if you were to look at it, the price of our rental housing is actually really high, and it doesn't necessarily match our wages either. If you start looking and digging into the percentage of our economy that's service sector versus what people are paying for rent, they're paying much more than 30% of their incomes in housing prices. So we have not a lot of supply. We have very high cost of housing, which makes housing a challenge in our community. Just to provide everybody some background, I think some of you have been around and have been tracking this, but the housing issue is not new to McCall. We've actually been working on this for a while. What I'm calling sort of our early housing initiatives started around 2005, right? So we started seeing, again, the cost of housing increase. We could look towards other mountain communities and say, we know we're going to have a housing crisis. At that point, the city had an inclusionary housing ordinance as well as a community housing fee. A housing authority was set up at that point. Ultimately, the city was challenged by the Central Board of Realtors. It went to district court. It was found unconstitutional. It never got elevated to the Supreme Court, but at that point, the city repealed all of the ordinances related to those efforts, and that kind of stopped. Some of the other communities had to do the same thing within the state. So those tools are no longer available for us. The recession hit. We kind of focused on some other issues, things like our downtown master plan and some other planning initiatives during that time, but we knew housing wasn't going to go away. So we were always talking about it internally. When we decided to go back and do our comp plan update, we rolled a housing strategy as part of that process. As you might remember, we called it McCall in Motion. It included our comp plan, our housing, as well as our transportation. And at that point, we were kind of experiencing planning fatigue with our community. So we were like, let's go ahead and wrap those all together. From there, we got kind of that needs assessment to sort of understand what our current situation was at the time and kind of basic tools. So from there, staff took that and said, what are 6 specific things that we could implement? So we looked at things like rebranding our program from community housing to local housing. Rather than rolling out programs that were regulatory based, we moved to an incentive based strategy. So we started the deed restriction incentive program at that point. We went through and did a whole series of code amendments to build in incentives like double density, height increases, setback reductions, those types of things. We put in provisions for temporary housing, so businesses could house their employees on site with temporary things like yurts and RVs and that type of thing. We identified annexation as a potential because that's a discretionary action. So there's opportunities to negotiate housing in that process. And so we did all of those things, and then we were kind of like, now what? So these were kind of more like city-specific focused efforts. And at the time, there was a lot of, like, especially larger employers and people in the community talking about housing, and kind of everybody was running off. So we said, okay, we need a process that's more specific, something like an action plan. We need to get together with all of our community partners, public, private, and nonprofit, and put together a plan. What are we going to do in the next 5 years? And so we'll get into the outcomes, but that basically was our McCall area local housing action plan. As I mentioned, that was adopted in 2022. And we did that during COVID. So we did most of it remote. I think we had one meeting at the very end all together, but some really good things came out of that. And just to remind you what our definition of local housing is, it's dwellings of all type that those who live and or work in the McCall area can afford to purchase or rent, serving the entire spectrum of the housing needs that are not being met by the housing market. And again, to remind you what our housing rainbow looks like. So these are often used in housing plans, but basically what the housing rainbow shows is all the different types of housing that can be found within the community. So everything from supportive housing all the way up to luxury home housing. And then it attaches different AMIs to the different types of housings. And then those arrows, because you probably can't read them, are the specific strategies that were identified by our steering committee and then assigned to those different types of housing and income levels. So within the plan, we set 3 major goals. One of them was about addressing income levels. So we acknowledge that there's some federal programs for some of the lower income housing. And so the focus really was to focus on sort of that missing middle. Again, not wanting to lose like our middle class. So so it's basically up to AMI, 100% AMI for rentals, 150% of average median income for home ownership. The committee set an ambitious goal of trying to bring on 50 units per year. to address local housing. And then there's also the concern that we've been shifting from, I know when I moved to the community about 20 years ago, it was about 40% local residents and 60% second homes. Well, that's shifted. And so, now we're basically about 30% locals. And so the goal with some of these policies is how do we try to shift back so we're more of that year-round community? And I know those numbers are kind of shocking, but how do we kind of get back and how do we create more housing so that we stay a real community? And that was really the focus of our comp plan. Our housing strategy was kind of the biggest threat to McCall is becoming a place where people just go on vacation and losing that year-round like local workforce as well as community. Any questions on that? Okay.
Oh, this is great. Thanks.
Okay, so just to also remind you of some of our local housing tools that are available today. So we do have a deed restriction incentive program that's going, and we'll talk more about that as we get further into this work session. We've done at least I think we've done 2 rounds of code amendments trying to remove any regulatory barriers as well as incentivize housing. We know we can't require it here in Idaho, so we really try to create incentives so that people want to create local housing from the private sector. The city council created a land banking fund, so you've been slowly acquiring funds in that, and I'm happy to say we're kind of getting to a place where we're going to start putting those funds to action. And that has taken a little while. So we also added local housing to our new urban renewal district. And so it is eligible for funding within the new urban renewal district and it's an identified use within the plan area. We also have done some things related to donations, so adaptive reuse of structures. And then probably where we focus a lot of energy, and you've seen our planning staff when people come in to do projects, we really try to encourage people to include local housing into their development plans and have had some success with that. So I thought this was good just to give a sense of our staff put together, we track a local housing units, and this is provided to you in a handout or it was emailed out to you. But basically, first I'm going to talk about the completed units. So, so some of these, right, are deed restricted and some are not, and it may not be 100% comprehensive, but we have 72 apartments. That's the Springs, right? That's an income qualification project, and Adrian's going to talk a little bit about how those funding sources work and how those projects come to be. But we also have 12 condo units that are deed restricted. So that's the Thompson Place project that everyone I think is familiar with. We have 1 townhome that currently has a deed restriction that's in Broken Ridge subdivision. And then we have 1 ADU that has a deed restriction on it. So you can see those are completed units to date. Above that are projects within the entitlement process. So we thought this was important for the council to understand without getting into the super specific details. However, if you're interested, I can provide you that information. This is kind of generalized information. Is basically we have a number of projects that either have been entitled and they haven't been constructed, or they are in the entitlement process. And so we have had some projects that have been entitled and there's been some hiccups related to sewer, right? So we know that's a big barrier to providing more housing units and density within our community at this point. So, so we have 54 potential deed restricted long-term rentals in the pipeline. Not deed restricted long-term rentals, we have 70. 4 condo units with deed restriction, 6 townhomes with deed restrictions, and 1 ADU. So you can kind of see those numbers. So we anticipate, in the next several years, we're going to hopefully see many more units come online that have deed restrictions on them. And just to remind the council, what our deed restriction program is, it's not income based. It's based on Are you employed with a local employer, which is defined as a broader area than McCall area, but that they're physically an employer or based here. You also can be a senior or a person with disabilities. You have to, they can't be short-term rentals, and you have to work a certain number of hours per year and per week kind of thing. So it's really more of an employment program than it is an income-based. That program is under review, and we'll talk more about that too as we get further into this.
Michelle, I have a question on these numbers. Does that include the private sectors such as the hospital housing, the school housing?
Yes.
That's okay, great.
Yeah, that's kind of included in here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adrian to get into Housing Policy and Finance 101.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And I did want to say that the local housing action plan that you all put together is quite impressive. And so my comments here are to give you some context for how some of those elements of your local action plan can be implemented. So what finance resources are available at the federal and state level? What kind of partnerships do you need in order to bring some of those partners to the city of McCall in order to implement various sections of your action plan? Next slide, please. And Michelle, would you mind just pulling up all of the bullets? Thanks.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. That's great. So I'm going to talk briefly about what public state and federal resources are available, both specifically for housing authorities, then other affordable rental housing. There's limited home ownership funding at the federal level, but I have a little caveat about that one. Then talking about, in general, who develops affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I'm really not talking about the missing middle. What I'm more talking about is 80% of area median income and below, and most specifically about 50% of area median and below. And so for a family of four, for example, that's about $45,000 a year. So those would be people who are, cleaning hotels, not working full time, potentially working in the restaurant industry, and other lower wage workers in McCall. Then talking about potential roles for the city of McCall in implementing and obtaining or working with these funding sources. I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between the powers of a housing authority and the powers that the city has. And then Michelle's going to talk some about the deed incentive and restriction program. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is actually a simplified version of federal housing funding. Federal housing finance is extraordinarily complicated, but you do have examples within your local jurisdiction of entities that are creating housing using these federal funding sources. And so if you look on the left-hand side of this diagram, you'll see it says U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and right underneath that, public housing. And that usually means housing authorities. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. On the right-hand side, it also says U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, but those are different divisions and departments within HUD. And so HUD is divided. Their funding sources go in different directions. And on the left-hand side, funding sources go directly to housing authorities. On the right-hand side, which actually is substantially more money, goes largely to nonprofits, but also can go to potentially urban renewal agencies, sometimes goes to housing authorities, sometimes goes to for-profits. So the way at the federal level, housing authorities work is that you have to be certified to receive federal housing funding. HUD has divided up different regions of the country, has certified different housing authorities through a very complex process. And then every year Congress allocates a certain amount of money that goes to public housing. There are formulas that then distribute the money 2 different housing authorities throughout the country. That those resources have been diminishing over time, probably since the 1980s, and there's been a shift more to the right-hand side. And that's because the federal government, Congress in particular, but also through the direction of presidents over time, has said, let's move away from creating government-funded housing, and instead, let's create incentives for the private sector to create affordable housing. And so the largest source for rental housing right now is on the far right-hand side of a column here, and that's the low-income housing tax credits. Michelle mentioned earlier that we do have a low-income housing tax credit development in McCall that's developed by the housing company. It's out past the Muni buildings. If you're leaving McCall, heading down to Boise, on the left-hand side, a very large development. And so what a low-income housing tax credit is every state gets a certain amount of tax credits, and it really is a credit on taxes, tax credits. And in this case, they go to the Idaho Housing Finance Agency. The Idaho Housing Finance Agency runs a competitive process through point structures. They have different priorities. So, for example, they have a 15% set aside for rural housing. McCall qualifies for that incentive. And then nonprofit developers or for-profit developers apply and say, we would like to obtain those tax credits. And so they get an allocation of tax credits, and then they go out into the market and they sell them to corporations, oftentimes banks, and say, the Idaho Housing Finance Agency just gave me $1 million worth of tax credits. Will you buy them from me? Yes, great. And so then the housing company gets $1 million from Bank of America because they've sold their tax credits, and they're able to build housing. The tax credits are only really intended to be 70% of a project budget. So, okay, what happens to the rest? How do you build this housing? You use other funding sources, and you'll see that on the far right here: bonds, loans, other federal fundings. Could be ARPA. In McCall, the USDA is also a really good source of funding for housing in McCall. The Idaho Housing Finance Agency also receives other funding from HUD. You probably have heard of the Community Development Block Grant that's been used for street and other improvements in the city of McCall. Another use potentially is housing, though it is a limited resource. So, I would advise to try to maximize any of the other sources you have. But some of the other sources that flow from federal HUD dollars to the Idaho Housing Finance Agency also include something called home funds, the National Housing Trust Fund, and then another source that's called McKinney. And those funds are usually bundled together by nonprofit or for-profit developers, sometimes housing authorities, to build housing within communities. I'm going to pause there for a second because that's a lot of detailed information, and see if folks have any questions about this slide.
That's an impressive slide.
A lot there.
I almost raised my hand really fast because I go, what? You kept saying to the right, you were talking about the middle, and then we got over to the far right, at least the way I'm viewing the screen, in Department of the Treasury, and you answered all my questions, so I didn't have to raise my hand. Adrian, that was great.
Okay, thanks.
But bigger picture, it's really encouraging. Here's the big take home I got. Number one, there is a housing authority we can work with.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways for the city of McCall to be a partner in tapping into this federal money.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the big takeaway I got. And
yes,
smart people like you and Michelle know how to do that. So it's really encouraging.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing. Actually, on Monday, I was at a conference for housing and economic development, and we organized a tour with some of the other mountain communities, so Ketchum, Driggs, and the counties. And we we actually did a housing tour of a number of projects that are occurring in Boise. And so we visited a number of LIHTC projects. And so I remember like one of the projects, they're like, this took 17 different funding sources, right? These are very complicated projects. And so people who work and develop in this realm are pretty specialized. And so often we talked about it among the different communities because we often hear in the community, why are these incentives not provided to local builders and things like that? These projects are very, very complex and kind of a specialty. And so what's exciting about, I think our region is due to receive, if we have an opportunity to partner with a sophisticated housing developer or nonprofit to tap into these funding sources and try to figure out how to pull multiple funding sources together. I think we're kind of due because they like to do like a geographic distribution. So we're kind of due to receive another one. And the projects that we have kind of in our region related to these products are basically 100% occupied. I mean, there's way more, and there's a waiting list. So there's way more demand for these types of projects in our area than we have available. So I think that's actually encouraging that it's kind of like if we can figure out how to pull this off and partner with a number of different things and pull together different funding sources, we can potentially make a project like this happen again within our community or our region.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And Michelle is right on. One of the things that the Idaho Housing Finance Agency prioritizes in any funding round is they look at different regions of the state and says who hasn't had a project within 5 years, for example, and then they prioritize those regions so you get extra points if you're in one of those regions, and that's where they have a first look. So Michelle's right. McCall is primed within the next couple of years if you develop a partnership to bring in another development that could be similar to either the housing company development that's here, or I'm going to talk in a minute about smaller infill development as well. Next slide, please, Michelle.
And I have a question.
Bill had a question.
I have a question there too. Can you look at that and think of it's complex, it's competitive, and therefore it takes staffing and we think about Michelle's department, the demands are already excessive. And so to me, and I look and think how we're going to address the staffing issue to pull this off is what I'm listening for. And I imagine it's in the presentation coming. So
Great.
we recognize there's a lot.
Spoiler alert.
Great question, because that brings up the next slide. That you're right on. That's an absolutely, and Michelle, yeah, if you would pull up all the bullet points on that, that's great. So really, they're thinking about the city of McCall and how do you drive some of those resources here. There are really two avenues to doing that in terms of staffing. And you can use a combination of both of these. You can use them sequentially, which we can talk about, when's the right time to use one tool versus another tool. And so first I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a housing authority and what does it do. And then I'm also going to talk about city staffing and nonprofit partners and other partners and what can happen in that realm. So first, public housing authorities. So, as you know, there's a state law that says how do you create a housing authority? So there's really two different types of housing authorities. The traditional housing authority that most people think of is the one that receives federal funding. That is highly complex, and so for those, you have to be created under state law. It's governed by federal law. Federal regulations apply. As I mentioned earlier, the money is received through a federal budget allocation, then a federal formula that just goes from the state to the local areas. Housing authorities, both under federal and state law, are governed by commissioners. And so under Idaho state law, you all would appoint the commissioners for the housing authority. And under the state law, it's 5 to 7 members. One of the members must be assisted by some of the housing in the community. And then this Idaho state law says that no commissioner may be an officer or employee of the city. So it's intended to be governed separately from the city. It's a quasi-governmental entity. Housing authorities, both under state and federal law, have unique powers. They can issue bonds. They have a power of eminent domain. Some people call that condemnation. And so you can condemn property for the purposes of affordable housing. That is, again, a very complicated process, very complicated, both politically and under the law. They have the powers to develop housing, to manage the housing, and to lease property. As I mentioned before, funding comes from the federal if they're federally qualified. If they're not a federally qualified housing authority, they have no funding. It's a shell corporation, quasi-governmental organization. And as your housing action plan talks about, the city of McCall would fund the housing authority. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a big shift at the federal level since the 80s, funding away from developing public housing and instead creating incentives for the private market to create housing. And one of the existing roles and responsibilities of federal housing authorities is they distribute something that's called Section 8 vouchers. It's rental assistance, essentially. And so there are people who have these vouchers within the city of McCall right now. And what it means is if I qualified from an income basis for one of those vouchers, I take it to a private landlord and I say I have this voucher. They're going to pay, HUD is going to pay market rate rent to you. And then what happens is the tenant themselves, because they're income qualified, pays only 30% of their income for rent. There is a very large waiting list for those subsidies at the moment. Next slide.
Oh, wait, there's one last bullet. I just saw.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Okay. So so I've talked a lot about the federal housing authorities, but there are models that don't take any federal funding, that they just work with local funding. And the Blaine County model, the Blaine Housing Authority, is one of those examples. So they don't receive federal funding, but instead they receive money from both Blaine County, City of Ketchum, City of Bellevue, other jurisdictions, and so it's more of a collaborative. And so the housing authority's function is to pool money from several different local municipalities and then implement the plan that has been developed by the local municipalities together. So that's a different model. And right now, the McCall Housing Authority would fall into that category if you stand it up. For example, it's not federal; it's a local model, but it would have to be funded by local funds. Next slide.
Does that local model, Adrian, still have
Yes.
the same requirements for the commissioners, the 5 to 7, and one of whom must be in this and can't be employee? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes. Thank you. Great question. At the federal level, it's a lot more. There are more restrictions, but I don't see McCall going in that direction for the reason that I'll talk about on this slide. And so those are the state of Idaho laws. So there actually is a housing authority, a federally created housing authority, both under federal and state law, that does currently cover the city of McCall, and it's called SECA, Southwestern Idaho Cooperative Housing, and they cover 9 counties in southwestern Idaho, and they've developed and managed. Well, they didn't actually do development, but they manage 2 different housing complexes within McCall city limits right now. So one is on Floyd Street, that's senior housing, and also over on Sampson Trail, it's called Roseberry Court, and that's family housing. In addition, SECA administers all the Section 8 vouchers for the city of McCall as well. So when I actually talked to the executive director of SECA just to get a sense of what they do, what they're interested in, to better understand, you know, what they think about new development and things like that. And so this housing authority does have all of the powers that I talked about previously: the ability to bond, the ability to lease, manage, develop, power of eminent domain. So they have all of those powers. And, you know, frankly, they're interested in doing more work with the city of McCall. One of the things that the executive director talked about is right now they're working with the city of Cambridge. They're doing an infill project on city land in Cambridge. That's a fourplex. And so what something like SECA would do is pull together the resources. And so they primarily use USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, funding. Sometimes they use local funds, or in the case of Cambridge, they're using local property. And so their wheelhouse, if you will, would be local infill projects, smaller ground-related projects, such as the one that you see in the picture in front of you, which is the Roseberry Court housing on Sampson Trail. Any questions about SECA?
Well, we had up until today, those of us in the room that are political people, we haven't heard anything about that. That's really great news. And it's really exciting because it just seems so hopeless sometimes, that sector trying to do infill, trying to do tap into federal dollars. It's really exciting news.
Right. And that gets to the earlier question too about, gosh, how would city staff that are already very, very busy get into this very complex area? And so here, that's when I'll talk about partnerships a little bit more, partnerships is a way to do that. SECA knows how to get USDA funds. They said there's a funding round coming up. They've done it before. And so part of it is figuring out how you cultivate those partnerships and how you entice them to do the development that the city desires within city limits. But, you know, city staff then don't need to know, how do we get USDA funding? How do we pull down all of those complicated funding sources? How do we monitor for compliance and things like that? It's really about partnerships and what do you need for incentives to bring that type of development into the city. Okay, next slide, please. So I've really actually talked about this, and so I won't go into too much more detail, but there are a lot of fund sources that the Idaho Housing Finance Agency administers, and so that is the primary source for creating rental housing rental housing that is affordable throughout the state of Idaho. Michelle, next slide, please.
Do you want to talk about the homeownership?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. The Idaho Housing Finance Agency also has some homeownership programs, and I know city staff are familiar with some of these homeownership programs. You know, what we don't know is how many people within the city of McCall are aware of them. And so the primary program that they have is that it's a down payment assistance program. And so if one is income qualified, and so this does get to the missing middle, if one is income qualified, you can get a second loan from the Idaho Housing Finance Agency that will pay the majority of your down payment assistance. So for many new home buyers, and it doesn't have to be first-time home buyer, but for many home buyers, especially buying in high-cost areas, saving enough money at 20% down is nearly impossible. So what this does is it creates a second loan, and there's more complex regulations, as there always is, but over the course of time, depending upon what you as the home buyer select, some of it can be forgiven over time as well. So that is a way for people to get into homes within the city of McCall potentially. Great. So this one, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but this gets to Michelle's point earlier about how complicated it is to use the low-income housing tax credits. And so, you know, in the field, we call this the quote capital stack, the capital dollars that are used. And what I really just wanted to point out is the yellow, it's yellowy amber color there for each of these three different jurisdictions, and Idaho wasn't available in this example, but that local funding is also used in order to be one of the fund sources. As Michelle said, that one that they talked about in Boise had 17 sources. I don't think we need that many sources in McCall, but oftentimes there are multiple sources that are needed. And in fact, the Idaho Housing Finance Agency gives additional points if there is local funding within a project. And so what that means is if McCall had money available for creating a development such as the housing company development or one similar to that, McCall could say we have X dollars available, do an RFP for it. You know, we have X dollars available. We would want somebody to go in for the low-income housing tax credits. You would have applicants from, you know, different nonprofits available. You could also pair it with a city property as well to say, we have this particular city property. This is the type of development that we're seeking, and we have X dollars in order to put into it, and that would cause that particular project to be more competitive from the Idaho Housing Finance Agency. Next slide. So this is just an example of the capital stack that was used for the Springs done by the Housing Development Company. And so you really can't see that. I apologize right now, but they had loans from the Idaho Community Reinvestment Corporation. They also had money from the USDA. They had the low-income housing tax credits. So they actually used 3 to 4 different sources for that particular property. I think that they probably received additional points for that project because, Michelle, you can tell me if I'm wrong, it was actually county-owned land?
Yeah, the county basically deeded it to the housing company for the purpose of affordable housing.
Right.
So there's a deed restriction on that piece of property. If it were ever to go out, it reverts back to the county.
Right. And so that's a way both for the city to control the type of development that you wish to see, and also to control the long-term use of it. And then lastly, to obtain additional points so those projects actually do get funded eventually by the Idaho Finance Agency. Next slide. So this is a compare and contrast, excuse me, between what a housing authority can do and what can be accomplished just through city staff. And so, as I mentioned before, thinking about who sets the policy for each of these different entities. And so the policy for housing authority is set by the housing authority commissioners. If we're not talking about a federally funded and a federally funded housing authority, and I'm just talking about a state created housing authority, which you have already created that through ordinance right now. That would be funded by the city itself. Federal funds would not, it's not impossible that you would ever have federal funds, but SECA receives all the federal funds right now. Because those are diminishing resources, it seems unlikely that HUD would move funds away from SECA and move them to the city of McCall. And again, those are relatively scarce resources, so it's not a rich source to fund housing, and it also comes with a substantial amount of compliance requirements. Just a second, I need to grab some more water. So in terms of the infrastructure and mandates, you would create separate bylaws for the for the housing authority would need to have its own legal advice. If it were to pursue bonds, it would need to obtain bond counsel. It needs to understand what its own compliance is. It would also have to have its infrastructure for accounting, because it's a separate quasi-governmental agency. And so the accounting bylaws and everything would be separate from the city of McCall. In terms of staffing, the staffing expertise is different than what the city staffing expertise currently is, because it's really more a housing management and development company. And so you would need a high level person who understands how to work with developers in terms of how to actually create the development itself. So what do they do to develop? How does one manage the housing once it is developed, and then actually manage the whole infrastructure? So what do you do about the landscaping? What do you do about maintenance of the structure? How do you think about long-term maintenance of the structure, of the structures? And then you need the staff who have experience in leasing it up, knowing landlord-tenant law. And so it's a different expertise than what city staff have. It also, as I mentioned earlier, has unique powers. They can develop, manage. They have the power of eminent domain, and they can issue bonds. So just two side comments about two of those powers. I was looking to see if Blaine County has issued any bonds and used the power of eminent domain, and I haven't found that they've used either. I know in my experience, housing authorities are very reluctant to use eminent domain because it is highly controversial for any entity, whether it's government or someone else, to come in and say, I'm going to take your property for purposes of eminent domain. And so if somebody's willing, something can be sold under the threat of eminent domain. And so that power can be helpful in that regard. In terms of issuing bonds, generally it is very sophisticated housing authorities that issue bonds. I would imagine that SECA is not in a position to issue bonds. Probably something more like Boise Housing Authority has the sophistication to issue bonds. So it is a power, and whether the entity is able to take advantage of that power really depends on the sophistication. Now, switching over to the right-hand column, so that a city's role can be very different, and it really is more about policy, funding, and partnership. And so, for the funding for city staff, you as the governing body set the policy. You tell your staff, this is your direction. This is what you want to do, as opposed to the housing authority commissioners. Funding is the same. You would, City of McCall would fund any housing programs coming from the city. You're using the existing infrastructure, existing city staff, as Michelle I know has mentioned. There is right now a process out there to hire a housing planner. And so there's one person who would be responsible for the existing programs and funding that pertain to housing within McCall. That person traditionally would conduct RFPs, develop all the partnerships with both the other governmental agencies, so the Idaho Housing Finance Agency, nonprofit housing developers, for-profit housing developers, SECA, the Southwestern Idaho Cooperative Housing Authority, et cetera. Then the powers that the city has is you are able to allocate money from the city budget. There's a local option tax. There's your partnership and connections with the McCall Redevelopment Agency to talk about how those funds are used, and then you're able to integrate the housing resources with other city programs and services. So you can be strategic in terms of opportunities for if McCall is developing something else. So if you were just starting the library right now, would you create housing on top of the library? I mean, so there's those type of opportunities. If you're going to do other redevelopment of the municipal complex, are there opportunities to create housing there? So I'm going to stop right there, but as you can see, in summary, the difference in the types of powers are a housing authority develops and manages housing, similar to another housing development company. And then on the city side of things, it really is implementing policy, funding rounds, and partnerships. And so for the partnerships, what the city would be doing is making the partners responsible for the complexities of some of the housing finance streams that I talked about earlier. And so you would make the SECA, you would make the housing company responsible for coming up with all of those other housing structures, but you say, we have this money or we have this property available. This is what we want to see happen. So I'll stop right there and see if there are questions about this slide.
Great. Adrian, we have one council member Machezik, that needs to leave in a few minutes. I'm going to ask Mike if you have any questions that you'd like Lyle and I and Julie to follow up on during the rest of the presentation.
I'm good, Bob. Thank you for checking in. I do need to go, and all good stuff.
It is all good stuff, and we'd be glad to fill you in when you get back next week. And yeah,
I'll check in with you, Bob, later. And you
thanks.
can fill me in.
All right.
Great.
All
Thank
right.
you, guys. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Great to meet you.
I'm good with where we're at, Michelle. This has been great. We'll keep rolling.
Okay.
I'm good where we're at too, but the questions that are formulating is kind of, are we going to operate on the left-hand side or are we going to operate on the right-hand side as we go forward? And where SECA is maybe our left-hand option. And then also my understanding is that the West Central Mountain Economic Development Council has a housing authority stand-up or thought process too. So anyhow, I'm just really interested in and then the third column in my mind, that housing authority, city staff, consultant driven, a staff and consulting arm. So anyhow, I think that'll come to bear, but it's complex, but it's getting clearer to me. So thanks. I don't know if I made my clear on that. I'm still trying to think.
Councilmember Nelson, I do understand your questions. I'll try to answer some of them in the next couple of slides, but ultimately it'll be a council decision about whether you operate on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, or a combination of both. And I think, as I said earlier, I think there's a way to sequence that as well.
Great, you answered my question. I'll follow along.
Okay.
Hold on just 1 second.
Hey, I would say too, I came in kind of going, wow, this is just so complex and so difficult, and I can't think of the success model in the Western mountain towns, but I'm beginning to be more optimistic.
Michelle, I can just talk off my notes here for those slides.
Sorry, my computer went to sleep, so I got to re-pull it up.
So the next thing that I just wanted to mention is who are your potential partners here? So again, you don't have to do it all, but what the city brings are really some funding sources, the ability to create policy, and some staffing resources. So who are your partners as you move forward? Well, one I've already mentioned, existing housing authority. SECA is a potential partner. Secondly, for-profit developers. The staff have been doing a great job in trying to generate interest amongst the for-profit developers in doing the deed restricted property. There have been some inquiries from for-profit developers who also use the low-income housing tax credits. And so for-profit developers are really a rich resource for implementing some of these goals. In addition, owners of existing housing. And so as Michelle mentioned, how do we get some of our owners of existing housing to convert to long-term rentals from short-term rentals? And, you know, as Michelle has noted, anecdotally, there are some of the management companies that are really trying to make the case that it's more lucrative, better for the community for people to have longer-term rentals versus short-term rentals. Thanks, Michelle. And really, Michelle, you feel free to take it down. That's, you know, it's fine if it's too much of a hassle. Nonprofit developers, the housing company, Habitat for Humanity. You know, there are really different partners that can help you with different portions of your plan. Your rainbow of housing that Michelle showed you earlier, there are different partners that can help in different areas. And so the housing company in SECA can help with below 80 or 50% of area median income. You can have other partners like a Habitat for Humanity that can go to, or other land trusts that could go to a higher level. So if you're focusing on homeownership, for example, the model that you used for the community housing over on Lenora, where the city has lease to the land, so you take out one of the highest costs for developing home ownership, and then you have restrictions on resale. You can have a nonprofit come in, develop home ownership type housing. You know, that's a model. Potentially cultivate relationships with existing land trusts. So, you know, just a question, you know, that if I were your new housing planner, I might talk to the land trust and say, would that help you build capacity if you also helped us with restrictions for housing that for local workers here? And so part of it really is cultivating those relationships. Employers, the city's doing a great job of working with local employers and trying to create housing as well. Okay, so all the roles that you play, you've already are doing a lot of this, and Michelle will talk about what you've accomplished so far. But the city's roles are policy, for one, the local housing action plan, the comprehensive plan, are the policy frameworks that you're working to implement this. Your implementation is your zoning, your deed incentive programs, any new programs that you come up with. Implementation is also development of those partnerships that I mentioned. Your funding, potential funding opportunities are your local option tax, your budget, working with the redevelopment authority on tax increment financing. And then you have a range of programs that could be funded. One of the things that I've learned over time is when you're thinking about your different funding sources, it's oftentimes best to think about certain funding sources dedicated to as a particular housing tool. So, for example, for the deed restriction program, you may allocate one funding source for that. You may have a different funding source that you can use for if you wanted to try to work with SECA or another nonprofit, for example. Because what happens is if you have many different types of housing that you're trying to drive into one housing source, you really have a hard time accomplishing what you're trying to do because you divide up the money into two small tranches so that you don't wind up creating what you're desiring to create. So by prioritizing as you have done so far, first, the city is prioritizing on local housing, the deed restriction program. Then you think about, are there other portions of this that we're going to try to implement? What funding source do we use for, after we've developed a policy for a particular program? And then so the different types of programs that you have been funding or could fund are the deed restriction incentives, leasing property for housing, such as Lenora Avenue or what Valley County did um, for the housing company, land purchasing and land banking. You know, frankly, that is one of the best tools that you can utilize, because land is almost always one of the most expensive and limiting factors in developing housing. It also gives you a substantial amount of control. And you can also decide, you know, by using a leasing process, you can think long-term for the city of McCall. So maybe there's going to be another future need, you know, 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line. And if the city is only leasing the property for housing right now, maybe there's another need 50 years in the future. So it enables future city council members to determine at that time what the driving community needs are. You can fund land trusts to work for homeownership housing, fund organizations like a Habitat, which is also home ownership money. And then you can fund the housing authority and the city staff. You know, sometimes cities also contract with nonprofits to do some of the more complicated work if they don't have city staff to do it as well. And then lastly, the city can work on educational resources, helping people understand where do they go to find affordable housing. So if they have a particular income level, what can they do if they qualify for a Section 8 voucher, or even that a Section 8 voucher is available, or, for example, the home ownership program that I talked about from the Idaho Housing Finance Agency, making sure that people in the community are aware of that as well. So that is the end of my slides. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind taking them down, and I'll just see if we have other questions for my slides, and then we can go back to your slides, Michelle. Thank you.
Okay, before we do that, we're going to take a 5-minute break really quick.
Excellent.
So about a 4-minute break. Use your Apple phones or whatever devices you have. At 10:25 Mountain Time, we'll resume. So if we could press that button. Yeah, 10:20. I really appreciate it. And we want to stay till 11. We
Yeah.
don't want to shortchange you at all. So
Well,
you just keep running
Yep.
and doing a great job. It's been really helpful. Okay. Hey, this is Mayor Bob. I am back at my desk here at American Legion Hall. And Lyle will be seated next to me in just a minute. Julie's still online, so we are going to start back in. And thanks for giving us a quick break. Also wanted to compliment everyone on the great questions being asked and the answers. This has been really helpful. I do not want to cut this presentation short, so we are eager to hear from you right up till 11 o'clock.
Okay, do we want to wait for Lyle to come back? Okay, then I'll just keep moving and we can revisit the conversation about housing authority when Lyle's back, because I think he had some more questions about that. So one thing I did want to let the council know about is we put a deed restriction program in place the council adopted in 2018. And at the time we said, we're not really sure, let's test this and we'll probably be back to you. This year, we're gonna, in working with Adrian, we're actually doing a formal review of this program because now we have some experience administering it and we know what's working, what's not working, and what we think we might want to change. So that'll be a whole separate work session on our deed restriction program. But I wanted to let you know that that's, we've kind of just started that process. And we'll likely be coming back with some policy recommendations and changes to that program. Anything to add on that, Adrian? No.
No, thank you. No.
One of the things that did come up is, and I would say kind of the way that we've gotten the most units, and I need to clarify, Lyle, because you asked this question, does the summary sheet include employer provided housing? It actually does not. So that I misspoke on that.
So it's actually a little bit.
It's much higher.
On top of it.
So the most number of units we've actually been at least trying to track from all the different employers is through employer provided housing. So those are major employers like Brundage, St. Luke's, the school district, that sort of thing. And so we are tracking that, and we intend, all of these agencies were part of our partner organizations when we created the action plan. And when we get a housing program planner on board, we plan to reconvene that group because I think there's a lot of value in checking in regularly and seeing what people are accomplishing and how we can support each other. Some of the housing is located specifically within the city of McCall. Some of it's located beyond in some of the other surrounding communities, but we kind of like to track it within the city limits and then also regionally. I mentioned adaptive reuse. This is a city-owned project. This project is actually being used as a recruitment for new employees. And the idea, as you probably remember from the tour, is that this is set up with so we developed a lease. It's a 6-month lease. And so the idea is when we get a new hire, the person can land and have a place to live and give them the opportunity. A lot of our housing is kind of found through word of mouth and not sort of formal channels. And so this gives people an opportunity to land in our community and then hopefully find more permanent housing. Some of the challenges, I mean, I think doing housing is challenging anywhere in the country. It's especially hard in Idaho because some of our legal frameworks and some of our limitations on funding. We also have, as Adrian mentioned, there's kind of limited federal funding and it's very specific and complex. We currently don't have a state funding source for housing. So that's what brings us to kind of our local source. Currently, we tap into the local option tax as well as we'll be tapping into urban renewal. And there's always the general fund and there's always, the opportunity to create more dedicated local funding sources. One of our, I would say probably our number one challenge is a coordination with the sewer district. We have another public agency that manages our sewer systems. At this point, we don't have alignment on policy and as it relates to land use connections, priorities, that sort of thing. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the implementation. And then obviously up to this point, staff capacity, it's been existing staff who wear a lot of different hats at the city, trying to make housing happen and help keep the ball moving forward as we're kind of managing like numerous other roles. But I would say we do have successes. I would say our community has a lot of political and community support. Part of that is we're in a crisis mode, but there's also, I think, a lot of education and awareness that has happened over the years. So not all communities are pulling together, and I would say generally we tend to be pulling together. And so I think that's an opportunity to really get some things done. The council provided funding for a housing planner. At the time, we just said a staffing person for housing. We did look at more of that executive level for a housing authority director and realized like those positions are basically what our city manager wants, and we can't really afford it. So at this point, nor do, like, after a lot of conversations with Adrian, do we think like maybe the timing of that is quite, we're not maybe quite there yet. And we can talk a little bit more about that. I'm excited to say that there's now regional efforts, formalized regional efforts happening at housing. So the West Central Mountains is taking the lead in doing a needs assessment. The needs assessment is basically the first step in creating any sort of housing programs. So they're engaging the county and all of this surrounding cities, over 2 counties. So I think that's exciting because it's, you know, the city of McCall can be working on these things, but it's really is a regional issue and we need kind of everybody pulling. So we've also seen property managers encouraging long-term rentals as opposed to short-term rentals. We've kind of hit this place where in some cases it's more economically attractive to go with a long-term rental rather than a short-term rental. So that's kind of exciting to see that happening within our market and kind of through that facilitation. And then lastly, we've added local housing to our urban renewal agency, as well as when the last LOT was renewed, we added housing as an eligible funding source. So I think those are some of our successes that we've had to date. And this is a slide that I've been doing some presentations on kind of how you build a housing program. Amazingly, there's not a lot of other smaller communities that are doing what we're doing. So there's a lot of communities that take a hands-off approach to housing. They don't see it as their problem. And then there's other communities that are starting to do it. We see it in other mountain communities, especially those that have more resources than us. So places like Jackson, I would say, is probably one of the more successful mountain communities that is doing it. They also have different tools available. They've been doing mitigation since the mid-90s. So they basically have been collecting funds, which we're not able to do, you know, within the state of Idaho. But it's interesting to look at, you know, our community. And so my lessons learned are always, right, there's not a silver bullet. So we try to figure out as many ways to try to create housing through all these different avenues that we've discussed today. We definitely, it would be easy to throw up our hands and say, this is impossible. We're going to always be chasing this. We're not going to work on it. But quite honestly, I think my staff and I, this is what gets us up in the morning and gets us excited. It's so important to our community, and it's such a huge issue that absolutely we have to take it seriously, and we appreciate the council's support and the community's support in trying to make things happen. Also, I think as we start rolling out programs and policies, and it's really important to just sort of listen to what's happening and adapt our programs. And that's kind of where we're at with the deed restriction program. We need to be devoting community resources. It's easy to say we support housing and not put any resources behind that. And so I think we're slowly moving into that direction of actually putting some resources behind kind of the words that we use. I also think doing housing in a mountain community, and especially in Idaho, requires you to be really creative. I always say, like, nobody's really figured this thing out. So we always have to be open to new ideas and thinking creatively about it. And then ultimately, you know, we're going to have the most success when we can move together with our partners. So again, just going back to the housing action plan, we looked at 40 different strategies as part of that program. The committee narrowed it down and then prioritized it to 27. So these are our 27. So I actually created a handout, which you should have in front of you, or Julie, you'll have in an email. But basically, I'm kind of calling it like a report card. And this is, I know, not a very interesting format. And so we talked about this at this at the staff level, is the idea is to take ultimately all these words and maybe create some interesting graphics to sort of report back to the public, where are we at and what have we accomplished? Because we have accomplished some things since the adoption of that plan. But I think also tracking it in a sort of a detailed way is also important for both internal purposes as well as other for other reasons. So I know we don't have a ton of time, and I want to leave a little bit of time for discussion, but I'm going to kind of try to run through maybe at a high level the different strategies and where we're at, just to give you a sense. I'm not going to go into every little detail. But the first one is sewer district coordination. That was identified as the number one sort of barrier or challenge in creating housing when we went through our process. And so a lot of the proposed actions are related to coordination, getting together with them. As you know, we've reestablished the post-annexation JWAG. So that is our legal tool to hopefully getting more alignment on policies and trying to work out some of the issues related to the sewer. I will say that we are generally meeting monthly with the JWAG. We still have a lot of work to be done. There's also kind of still hasn't been kind of the general acceptance of adopting recent planning documents by the sewer district. But I think some of the content of our planning documents are hopefully getting kind of baked into the sewer master plan. So they're using things like the future land use plan, the zoning map, using that in their sewer modeling. And we've been coordinating quite a bit, especially with our consultant team on some of those things. So I think we have made some progress. I think we have a lot of work to do still there. And I will say, you know, the deed restriction program does offer a financial incentive, which can be potentially an offset for a sewer connection. I think ultimately the goal, though, is trying to because it's not an issue of capacity, it's kind of an issue of allocation and policy. So trying to maybe have the city propose some specific policies that prioritize local housing projects over other projects, as well as there might be opportunities for other agencies maybe to secure sewer connections in advance of some of these projects. So those are all things that we've been exploring internally. And I think we'll continue to sort of roll out as we work through that a little bit. But this is definitely a whole nother layer of challenge and hopefully opportunity as we work through some of those things. So any questions on that one? Okay. Housing organization, I want to get into this a little bit because Adrian introduced this, and I think Lyle had a really good question, like, hold on, I'm confused. There's all these different models. And so you might remember in our housing action plan, it basically said create a housing organization. And we went around and around on that. Is it a housing authority? Is it a city department? Is it a housing trust, which is a nonprofit? The recommendation was a housing authority within that housing action plan. And so the city council did take a step. They adopted a resolution so that we basically can establish a housing authority. That's kind of the first step. That in some ways, that's sort of the easy step. The next step is, right, basically creating this whole other separate entity, which requires creating bylaws, creating staffing, creating a board of directors, and then it also requires coordination then. So, so I have been holding back on the creation of the organization, even prior to Adrian coming on board, partially because I knew we were needing staffing for that. And it was a little bit it's a big lift, right? And then it's a whole another organization that we're managing. So in conversations with Adrian, we've kind of said, we see the value of a housing authority, but it might be a timing issue. And so at this point, and as I mentioned, when I worked with HR and developing the job description for the new housing professional, it kind of came out to be more of a housing planner. So basically a dedicated staff person who's maybe not that executive level running a whole organization and managing a board of directors, but somebody who is dedicated 40 hours a week to working on housing within the community economic development department. So that's where we're at. That position is being advertised. We're currently collecting applications. I think at this point, the recommendation is that we go ahead and we get that that housing planner engaged, and we continue to work on implementation of the action plan without creating a whole nother separate organization at this point, and see if there's opportunities to partner with our existing housing authority that serves a much greater area and try to make some things happen. So so that's kind of the recommendation. Kind of, it's a little bit of a deviation from where we've been past work sessions and that sort of thing. But it sort of feels like a lot of resources and effort to create another organization when we think we can maybe be more effective with the resources we have with a staff person, and then leave that for maybe a future endeavor as maybe something that we could grow into. So that's kind of to explain. The West Central Mountains has a housing trust. It's a 501c3 housing nonprofit. It had a board of directors. It went dormant for a little bit. They actually own some property. They do not have dedicated staff people. So it's reliant on a board of directors without staff. And I think the board of directors has recently changed. And there's an effort to sort of revive that housing trust. Again, great to have more organizations working on housing. There's an opportunity for more partnership. But so that's kind of where we're at with this idea of dedicated housing professional within the city. And quite honestly, that the person who is going to house the housing authority was still going to be an employee of the city anyway. So in some ways, it's a similar situation to urban renewal, where I'm the staff person for urban renewal. The difference there is you have 2 council members serving on the board, so you can make sure that you get alignment. And then everybody else is appointed, right? But we're still using, like in the housing authority, you're still using city attorney, city treasurer, right? You're still using all of the city resources. And so the question is, do we get enough benefit from that housing organization to create this whole separate legal entity and support of this legal entity? For those sort of benefits.
Yeah, I'm certainly leaning towards the direction you're suggesting. That it seems, the duplication of, and we're going to end up with another sewer district, a sort of type situation. And
yeah, because you have another board of directors that is appointed by the council, but potentially could go from a policy standpoint a slightly different direction.
It's not only a duplication, I think, could be worse than that. It could be not very nimble, very bureaucratic, and take a lot of energy, including attorney's help. And that what you brought to us, you and Adrian's idea, and we've been listening about, makes a lot more sense. More nimble. It's more able to change as we need to change. It takes the pressure off you personally, your position, to where you can do a good job and have a person focus on this. We can involve consultants, helpers like Adrian. We can get involved with nonprofits, with for-profits. And I think it's a really, it takes a lot of, you got to be humble to say, well, we were going down this direction. Now we think, here's what we've learned. We need to go this direction. But I think that's the right approach. We need to follow your lead on that. So Lyle and I are supportive on that. Julie, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it sounds like a good idea. I mean, to get something started, to get something going within the city. It seems like the housing authority idea, um, takes a lot of resources, and as Michelle said, that even some of the powers that they had, or maybe Adrian, maybe it was you that said this, the powers that they had. I mean, we're not seeing other housing authorities uh, really be able to use that unless they are much bigger and have those resources. So it doesn't sound like, we would probably be able to do that anyway, especially at first. I think, having somebody on staff that's housing planner will be, a lot of what you said, Bob, nimble, be able to work with the city maybe quicker than establishing a housing authority. And it's not to say that in the future we can't establish a housing authority. When we feel maybe we're more in a position to do that. And, we would have that housing planner on staff, hopefully to help with that even. So yeah, I
Well said.
agree with this direction.
Okay, great. And I mean, we don't have any formal action as part of this work session. It's more of just a discussion, but it's good to get that feedback because then we can tailor future agenda items and work sessions towards that direction.
So one other quick item before we forget. You mentioned this document,
Mhm.
which we're going through at a high level. And then you mentioned that there's a version that you could develop or may have already developed that has graphics, and we definitely need that because oftentimes people like Julie, Lyle, Mike and I and Colby, we get asked, hey, would you show up to Rotary? Be perfect, because sometimes as we're out having coffee and talking to people on the street, as I call it, we get asked this question. You haven't done anything, Mayor Bob. Your council's not effective at getting anything done for housing. So it'd be nice to have that tool in our
Yeah.
car, and be able to say, actually, here's some things that are going really well, and here's some things that are challenges.
Yeah.
That would be a good tool.
Yeah, and I think, my issue is, right, we're also busy and like in the weeds of trying to get things done that we don't always take the time to tell the stories. But now I think in working with, Erin, she can kind of take some of this information, I think, and translate it in a really visual and simple way for the public to understand, okay, I can see how many units, I know what's being done. And I mean, I think even our website and all of those things need to be updated to kind of tell the story of what we have in place and pull together some of the resources that are available that I feel like we can do a much better job on telling our story than we have up to date. So we will definitely work on that and provide you that information and make that publicly available and put it out there for the community to look at. So I'm going to skip the state ARPA funds because those have been dedicated to something else, and that was sort of a period in time. The deed restriction housing, as I mentioned, it's a program that it's currently under evaluation. So all of those proposed actions will be considered when we're looking at it. So what we're looking at is the program itself, the actual deed restrictions, the amount for the financial incentives, maybe looking at expanding that program to include different levels depending on the commitment for the deed restriction. So so that is something that will be a whole separate topic. I'm just excited that we're looking at that and revising that. Amazingly, like you could see from what's been completed and what's been entitled or in the pipeline, there's still interest in this program, even with if you look at other communities, we have a very low financial incentive relative to other communities that are doing these types of programs, but we're still generating interest. So that's exciting because we're still able to attract and get the private sector to put some deed restrictions on these units. So as I mentioned, the employer assisted housing, that's probably how we've seen the most units come online. And this is primarily from major employers. I mean, small employers can't really afford to do some of the things that are occurring, like purchasing existing properties and rehabbing them or developing or constructing new. And we continue to communicate with the Forest Service and looking towards other communities, how we can partner with these major agencies that have land and potential resources to make more units happen. So,
And I think we have major employers that aren't involved, that perhaps we could get them to be involved. I was thinking about Albertsons Corporation.
mhm,
You know, great
Yeah.
involvement with St. Luke's.
yeah, and
Ski resort, you know, down there in the Meadows on your picture. The school district, lots of big employers in the Forest Service. But there's still more out there that I think it would be great to bring into the fold and encourage them to help us.
mhm, absolutely. And once we have that housing planner on board, as I mentioned, we're going to try to reconvene that steering committee, which included all of those community partners. And that way we can kind of learn more and sort of figure out, how we can better move forward together. So public-private partnerships, as I mentioned, this is something like that sometimes happens at the land use process. Sometimes there's opportunities for it to happen at other levels, like with our urban renewal agency and private developers. So some of these things have been completed, some of them are ongoing, and some of them, there's still work to be done. So from there, I'll move on to taxes dedicated to local housing. So I think your recent decision, looking at how you're going to do local option tax, directly addresses this. It's like, we know every year there's a certain amount of funding that goes into housing. It's not a competitive process where housing's competing with some other nonprofit or some other city project. And I think that's really good because it creates that consistency. So we know we have an ongoing funding source to make things happen. I'm skipping over some of these. The rental second home conversion program, we've looked at that pretty in depth with our housing advisory committee, and then later or more recently at the staff level. There's the programs like leasing locals that other communities have done. These are programs that are very cash intensive. So you really need to have a dedicated local funding source. Most communities have about over $1 million that they put into these programs. We just don't have those funding levels to do that. But like I mentioned, we're starting to see some conversion from short-term to long-term happen naturally as our area is so saturated with short-term rentals, and we're going back to being less year-round and more seasonal again. So financially, sometimes it just makes more sense for people to enter into these long-term leases rather than doing the short-term rental market.
So that is very real. I was asked as a result of when our team testified down at Capitol Building, the chairman of that committee asked people like mayors to get involved and have coffee with managers of property. I did that this week, and I was really pleased to hear. So anyway, we talked about some ideas about that. But one of the things I learned was this large property management company manages about 189 long-term rentals currently, and about 130 something short-term rentals. So it was really encouraging. What you just wrote down here is actually happening. And these are, in my opinion, responsible companies doing the best they can.
Yeah, and so we've got 5 minutes left. I just wanted to keep track of the time.
Yeah.
I'll try to run through a few more and then leave the last couple minutes for discussion. And you have this, so you can review this. I'm happy to sit down with any of you and get into any of the details on this. And again, this is probably not as detailed as it should be anyway, but I just wanted to give you an overview of what were all the strategies and then put them in priority order, and then what's happening to date. And so, we're focused on those top areas, but sometimes there's opportunities to jump down on the list and say, oh, wait, number 20, here's a funding source. We maybe can make this happen. And so again, we're looking at all of these strategies and trying to figure out how to implement them over time.
I think that's a great point, Michelle. And you can actually just kind of maybe in that view of time, the
Yeah.
thing to sit that I think that's an important part. Something that was 20th becomes 8th. typically is how plans work. And I think this is a great document. I think the understanding that you put into this, I mean, to give us the understanding, proposed action status is super helpful.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we can just continually update and have available and kind of refine as we move through some of these things. But like I said, maybe I won't go through any more of them, but if you have any questions about any of them, I would say that the majority of these have come up in the last couple of years in one way or another. And so anytime we get an opportunity to try to make a strategy come or turn it into action, we do so. There are certain things that like we just, a lot of it comes down to funding, right? Like we can't create home buyer assistance programs if we don't have a funding source, right? So those are things that ultimately are lower on the list. And, you know, at some point in the future, if we ever have a dedicated local option tax to housing or some of those things, then some of those strategies would become more of a reality. But, you know, a number of these things take either staff resources or they take financial resources to implement, or it takes coordination, right? And so I think at this point, one thing I'll just conclude with is I think we have a number of funding sources that we've been building over the last 5 years or so that are actually becoming more significant. So I think there's going to be some exciting opportunities for the new housing planner and the community and economic development department and others to kind of try to stack those resources. So we have urban renewal is starting, it has over $600,000 now in the bank. Our land banking fund is getting close to $500,000. So that's exciting. And then we have our deed restriction program. I will say we have to continue to fund that because we actually have more entitled properties than we have funding. So we have to continue to fund those existing programs. So like I said, there's opportunities to, I think, leverage all of these existing resources with other resources and also try to figure out how to coordinate and take $1 and turn it into 10 kind of thing. So I do feel like we're finally in a place where we're getting some financial resources to make some kind of bigger moves. So I think that's pretty exciting. And then having that staff person, if we can get somebody on board, I think will really help too, because we'll have a lot more capacity to make some of these things happen more rapidly.
Michelle and Adrian, thanks for being really respectful of our time. I'm going to ask Julie and Lyle to join me in sticking around for another 15 minutes because I think we may have some questions. So if we still have a quorum to do that,
Yeah,
perhaps.
I can do that, Bob. That's fine.
Thank you, Julie. Lyle, you good?
Yeah.
Has put a lot of work into this. It's been great, and we will take this home and
I lost, I can't hear you guys. Can you hear me?
we're just trying to make sure that the computer doesn't go poof at 11 a.m.
Oh, okay. You're back at least on my.
Yes,
end.
so I'm just letting our technical people do that. And then I want to make sure we get a chance for Julie, Lyle, and I to have some dialogue with Adrian
Jump off.
and Michelle.
No, I just think that we need to share your slides with the plugins. We disconnected the room feed,
Oh,
so we haven't been on that the entire way.
can we not worry about it right now? Okay. All right, we're gonna keep going,
Okay.
not worry about our
So
view.
We'll adjourn around 11:15. And I'm sorry that we had to rush you through, but you can tell by our questions, we're very interested. And we certainly learned a lot. It's really encouraging. I think we need to focus on that. It's encouraging what we have accomplished. We have a good story to tell. We have some very daunting challenges, but this city, our community, and our council, we're right there with you. It's a big priority for us to try to solve. So let me let Julie and Lyle, and I may have some more questions, but we want to have some more dialogue with you, and thanks for a great presentation. Adrian, thank you so much. Please stay on the line with us, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks, me as well.
Okay. Fire away, people.
I don't know if I have any other questions right now. Adrian, Michelle, the presentation was great. It's a lot of information, but I think I would like to encourage Michelle, if that chart that you did is great. But as Bob said, we get questions from the community like, how come McCall's not doing anything? How come this basically the problem's not solved yet? I don't know any community that has the problem solved, but and as you mentioned, Michelle, there's no silver bullet, but I think having not to shortcut the discussion with the public, but at least having, if I could go like, hey, check out our website. We've got this, chart document or whatever the website tells, is being updated periodically, tells you where we're at, tells you what we're doing, tells you how we're trying to move forward, all the tools that are potentially available. I mean, I think, just, hopefully we will get someone on staff to help you with that, because I mean, that's one thing I, go back to is like, it's a complicated problem. We're trying to get somebody, on staff. We've dedicated dollars to that person. And because this isn't something that our current staff has a capacity to deal with full time. And so, it's like, it's one step at a time. We're trying to move there, but, I mean, there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle, which, as you've shown, we are chipping away at it, in different on different pieces, and it would be great to be able to send people somewhere to, for them to look at this information and to digest it. And even a simple table of, how many units we have, that one that you showed, or that chart, how many units we have, coming online, hopefully. I mean, I think, it's hard to track, obviously, because they're one development at a time, but I think a lot of people don't know, even with our most current approval of the apartment complex on Idaho and Ward, I mean, there's just some people that, aren't paying as close attention, obviously, to every city council meeting and what's going on and everything. So, just to have somewhere for people to go to and say like, oh, wow, yeah, they approved this project and this will, add on some, deed restricted housing, add on some, maybe it's not deed restricted, but it really is kind of designed to be local housing. And that kind of thing would be great.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. We'll work on that.
Lyle, your thoughts as we conclude today's meeting?
Yeah, so when we get asked on the street, where is the pressure points on the demands for city staff? And to me, the housing issue probably comes up as the primary thing that we hear, and also the environment. And of course, we did the climate action plan approval last night, which means more of Michelle's staff time being allocated to something new again. That's another high priority. So it leads me to setting up my point. I think getting the city housing planner on board, and we have been created some funding, right? So we've anticipated this. And I think your idea of, we stir the people who are looking at maybe a housing authority executive director, how we can put that into housing planning. I think that's a housing planner for the city. And then on the funding of that comes to mind, we have dedicated, I think the dedicated funding for the housing needs to be ascertained, like through lot. That's the priority that we're hearing from the community. Let's make it the priority on the lot also. I think we're testing the idea of impact fees and the legality of being in Idaho. Can you fund something that the community really wants from the impact that's creating that demand for housing? So I think that's really important to us. And the other thing, when we think about philanthropy, I think about what is the mechanism, the structure whereby people can do dedicated philanthropy. And I've always thought that the McCall Community Foundation, I look at the people my age around McCall that kind of thought this was one of the best places. This best thing I ever did was spent my life in McCall. And how are we steering that philanthropy towards this crisis center? And I think that they kind of formalize that structure. And my point comes to mind is how many people adjacent to the city limits or in the impact zone, even potentially, are property owners who could say, yeah, I give 5 acres to that. And that I even see them people I'd like to call on. And so I think that how we structure that to say, just think about on your property, there's going to be 20 families that can afford to live here. I mean, that is a pretty high philanthropy opportunity to present. I know this town gets tapped a lot, but I'd like to see also maybe that thing. And I'm much more optimistic that through ingenuity, creativity, what have you, and the fact that McCall's culture is the way it is, that we can solve this. And it's not solve it, but we can ease some of that pressure. Be the success story. You always hear, you don't hear any other mountain community town that did it. And we go, well, let's be the one.
Right on. I think that's what makes us a little unique. That was really well stated. So with that, I'm gonna thank everyone. Council, thanks for participating and showing interest, enthusiasm, and excitement about our accomplishments to date, and looking forward to getting to the real stuff down the road. Adrian, thanks very much for spending the whole time with us. Michelle.
Pleasure.
And your future time with us.
Yes, thank you.
We
In
will,
person next time.
Yeah. Oh,
We're-
hopefully. Yeah.
we're very needy. We will suck up a lot of your time, believe me. And Michelle, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
Please
thank
tell everyone, your staff who has helped
Hmm.
along this path, along with this presentation, that we really appreciate it.
Yep.
So I'm going to call for a motion to adjourn. Julie, would you make that motion?
Sure, I move to adjourn.
Second.
All right, a motion has been made and seconded to adjourn today's special meeting. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Have a good day.
Michelle,